EACC Math, lesson number 18, factoring trinomials. Today we want to look at how we pull apart a trinomial. And we're going to be working with trinomials of this general form down here, ax squared plus bx, or plus or minus bx, plus or minus c. Now, the ones we're going to be looking at, this first coefficient is going to be 1. We're going to keep it pretty basic today. So we want to be able to pull that apart. And you'll find out why that's important later on when we start solving quadratics. For now, we're just going to practice pulling it apart into its factors. Okay, so here's our first example, x squared plus 3x plus 2. Okay, here's your thinking. When we factor a polynomial, we're going to end up with two binomials. So I'm going to put my parentheses here, okay? Now, this first product, this x squared, comes from the product of the first two terms. So to get an x squared, they both have to be x. The second terms in each of my binomials, here's our thinking. I want two numbers who, when I multiply them together, their product is 2, but then they add up to 3. Okay, so the product is 2, and they add up or sum to 3. Well, 2 is pretty easy. The only two numbers I can multiply together to get 2 are 1 and 2, or whole numbers I should say. And since both my signs are positive, both of these should be positive also. Now, when you're factoring, I want you to always check your answers. Remember, we practice using FOIL real quick here first. So there's x squared outside, so here's a plus 2x. Inside, so here's a plus 1x, and last, there's a plus 2, so I get x squared plus 3x plus 2, and that's what I wanted, so it checks. It's real easy to check. Please do that. Okay, second example. Again, think to ourselves, we're looking for our binomials. What can I multiply together? What two binomials can I multiply together to get this trinomial? And again, we start here. Well, again, the first term in each binomial to get an x squared, got to be an x. Okay, so again, now we're thinking, what two numbers are factors of -2, or -12, I'm sorry, I should say. Factors, or product. Their product is -12, and then they add up to this middle number. Well, I've got some choices here. 12, -12. I can use -1, +12, +1, -12. I can use 3 and 4. I can use 2 and 6. If I think, though, 2 and 6 are the only ones that have a difference of 4. So if I used a +2 and a -6, I'd get my -4 in the middle. So that's +2 and -6. Again, checking, x times x is x squared. X times -6 is a -6x. 2 times x is a +2x. 2 times -6 is a -12. So I get x squared minus, oops, let's erase that. Minus 4x and minus 12. Okay, I want to go back here. And let's erase what we've done here. Suppose you were doing this problem and you said, okay, I'm going to factor this 2x plus 6 and x minus 2 because 6 times -2 is -12 and 6 plus -2 is 4. Not, missing or not catching, you needed that -4. Look what happens when I check it. So x times x, there's my x squared. There's a -2x. There's a +6x. And there's a -12. So I get x squared plus 4x minus 12. So I'm different here in the middle. Okay, so that's why you need to that's why you need to check your factoring. So make sure it works. Okay, another basic example. So here again, our leading coefficient is 1. So when I set up my binomials, I know all I have to do is multiply two x's together to get my x squared. So again, we want to look for two factors of 12 that add up to negative 7. Well, since it's a positive 12 and the middle number is a negative 7, I know my two factors have to be negative. So would negative 2 and negative 6 work? Well, negative 2 times negative 6 is positive 12, but negative 2 plus negative 6 is not negative 7. So those don't work. What about negative 3 and negative 4? Negative 3 times negative 4 is positive 12, and negative 3 plus negative 4 is negative 7. So those are the two factors I need, x minus 3 and x minus 4. And again, being a good math student, I'm going to check it. So there's x squared minus 4x minus 3x plus 12. So x squared minus 7x plus 12, and it checks out. We're good. Okay, now, we have some special products factoring a difference of squares. I want you to look at these two numbers down here, x squared and 9. Recognize that they are both perfect squares. I can take the square root of x squared, I can take the square root of 9. As long as that's true, and as long as the middle sign is a minus sign, difference, you can factor this way. So here's what you do. You set up your two binomials. You ask yourself, what do I square to get x squared? Well, I square x, so those are my first terms. Next is, what do I square to get 9? Well, I square a 3. 3 times 3 is 9. And then you make one plus and one minus, and it doesn't matter where you put the plus or minus, which one you make positive 3 and which one you make negative 3. Now we do need to check. X times x, there's my x squared. X times negative 3 is negative 3x. Positive 3 times 3 is is positive 3x. And positive 3 times negative 3 is a negative 9. And look what happens here in the middle. These two terms cancel out. So I have x squared minus 9. Okay, so that's a difference of two squares. And again, the keys here are this. These both have to be perfect squares, and it has to be a difference in the middle. And what I mean by perfect squares are numbers like 1's a perfect square, 4 is a perfect square, 9, 16, 25, 36, and so on. Those are all perfect squares. I can take the square root of those. Square root of 1 is 1, square root of 4 is 2, square root of 9 is 3, square root of 16 is 4, square root of 25 is 5, square root of 36 is 6. Okay? If that's the case, you can factor this that way. Okay, so let's look at this example. Here I have a 16x squared and a 25, and there's a minus in the middle. Well, I know 16 is a perfect square, x squared is a perfect square, and 25 is a perfect square. So I can factor these as a difference of squares. So, again, you're thinking, what do I square to get 16? Well, I square 4. What do I square to get x squared? Well, I've got to have an x there. What do I square to get 25? Well, I square a 5, and you make one then a plus and one a minus. And again, it does not matter which one. You make plus or minus. Again, conscientious student, we want to check. So we get our 16x squared. We get a minus 20x. We get a plus 20x. And then we get a minus 25. And again, these middle terms, one's negative, one's positive, are gone. So we end up with 16x squared minus 25. Okay, that's just some basic factoring, and again, we'll see later where this comes into play, why it's important. Just for right now, work on the problems that are in front of you, and again, like always, if you have questions, let me know. And again, this is the end of the road. See you next time.